In the Dark Souls series, the world is dying. Not just the current iteration of the world, but the entire cyclical universe it is built upon. Long, long ago, the old masters of the Age of Fire devised a scheme to stay in power, interfering with the natural rhythm of life and death and rebirth, exploiting the bodies and souls of the living world in a quest for immortality and infinite growth, trying to eternally forestall the Age of Dark and their eventual loss of control. But the world was not meant to be run like this. Infinite growth is impossible, and fires cannot burn eternal. The world the old masters have crafted is now twisted, perverted, aching to die. The ruins of long-forgotten kingdoms now collide with the dark and dirty towers of the current regime as the world disgorges its traumatic memories in a cataclysmic death rattle. In fact, the final battle of the franchise takes place long after a lifeless, ashen desert has claimed the earth. You, the latest sucker being used by the gods to extract one last diseased cycle from an unwilling environment, must face the oldest knight left alive, a man who refused to die and became corrupted after thousands of years gorging on the souls of fallen foes. One of the elements that makes the Dark Souls series so special to me is the way it uses this grim narrative to play with lost and abandoned spaces. When you arrive in whatever empire currently sits atop the social order, it is immediately clear its glory days are long past. Its people are corrupt or dead, its churches and fortresses are in shambles, and any rulers that remain are gnarled beasts, sitting on rotten thrones watching the luster vanish from their dilapidated castles. This is the world you're called to explore. And make no mistake, for all the talk of Dark Souls as a series about difficult combat, the true allure of the series is exploration. Combing through ancient, crumbling districts, discovering long-buried secrets, and letting the broken arches and tattered tapestries whisper whatever stories they have left to tell. Dark Souls is a series about places, and its final chapter contains some of its most haunted locales. Lothric Castle, the blighted seat of power for a boy king refusing to sacrifice himself to keep the Age of Fire alive. The Painted World, a hideaway for lost and unloved creatures who just want something resembling home. The Ringed City, a metropolis built on a divine dream, humanity's last, illusory refuge from the end. When you as the player enter into these alien spaces, two things happen. First, you feel lost and alienated and you ask, what is this place? Why is it here? Who is it for? The second comes later, sometimes in minutes, sometimes in months. Whether quickly or not, you begin to develop a sense for, if not the use of a space, the fact that a space was used for something important. One of my favorite examples of this is in the Cathedral of the Deep, a temple of reverence not for stories of a bright and burning holy light, but rather an abyssal, chthonic depth, the blackness of a bottomless sea that might consume the earth, if you believe the visions of the perverse saint who resides here. There's a small staircase that many players will miss, winding down into an unassuming nook tucked away from the rest of the cathedral. An evangelist of the deep, gazes out over a balcony. If you kill her and look from her vantage point, you see a small, pitch-black lake. There are other bodies of water in this world, but this one seems to swallow any light that touches it. Why is there a black lake here? Why was the evangelist looking towards it? And why is there a tiny retreat seemingly tailor-made for someone to keep watch? Is this lake a seed of the deep to come? Is this alcove a space for contemplation or cultivation? It's impossible to say, but we know that this nook is here for something. You, the player, may never divine its secrets, but there's no question that someone built this place for a specific, perhaps sacred purpose. The Dark Souls franchise is full of spaces like this: ramshackle chapels, derelict tombs, lifeless galleries, and moldering libraries. They meant something to someone decades ago, but whatever emotions or histories they were intended to convey to the erstwhile inhabitants of these cursed lands, you'll never know. But that doesn't stop the intrepid explorers of these spaces from seeking to know them deeper, from cobbling together the barest bones of stories from scraps of item inscriptions and whispers of dialogue. The spaces within the world of Dark Souls, even as they decay unto nothingness, demand contemplation and curiosity. Naturally, I'd now like to direct your attention to dead malls. Unless you're brand new to YouTube, you've probably noticed the late 2010s cultural phenomenon of people exploring dead and dying malls, set to creepy, echoing versions of music, as if we were hearing the ghosts of songs that had once played over the speakers. Many cultural critics have discussed the inherent eeriness that comes from walking through empty spaces that once were full of life and conspicuous consumption. This is particularly true for my generation of millennials, who may be the last of the true mall rats. As we patrol the inoffensive tile floors of buildings with names like Westfield, Eastdale, Northridge, South Point, the Galleria, the Promenade, the Grove, the Lakes, and the Summit, I want us to consider: what is a place? Anthropologist Marc Auger writes about spaces concerned with identity, relations, and history. The location of your birth becomes your birthplace, an area that can define your culture, the way you speak, the things you eat. Venues like your home or your school or your neighborhood are places in which many things and people exist together in relationship. This is your bed, this is my porch. The teacher will give you your next assignment. Your father would like you to share your toys with your little brother. I grew some extra tomatoes. Here, have some. Lastly, places have some form of history, some form of continuing, if minimal, stability. A place is where we are a fraction of an ongoing story being told over time, ones with scenes of joy, pain, anger, sorrow, lust, despair, or peace. Of course, this raises the question: if you're somewhere that does not conjure identity, does not foster relations, and does not evoke history, where are you? Auger writes, "If a place can be defined as relational, historical, and concerned with identity, then a space which cannot be defined as relational, historical, or concerned with identity will be a non-place. The hypothesis advanced here is that supermodernity produces non-places, a world where transit points and temporary abodes are proliferating under luxurious and inhuman conditions, where a dense network of means of transport which are also inhabited spaces is developing, where the habitué of supermarkets, slot machines, and credit cards communicates wordlessly through gestures with an abstract, unmediated commerce. A world surrendered to solitary individuality, to the fleeting, the temporary and ephemeral. Think about parking structures. Think about freeways. Think about airports, particularly in terms of how train stations used to look. For me, shopping centers like big box stores and shopping malls are quintessential non-places. The spaces themselves are designed to keep people enclosed in a retail hierarchy with very little to distract them from their role as consumers. The architecture of the spaces is, if not bland, at a minimum ruthlessly corporate approved, designed by shareholders more so than artists or cultural tastemakers. We can all basically recall what our local Best Buy or shopping mall interior looks like, but probably only in the broadest strokes, and only because all of these places kind of resemble each other anyway. Am I remembering the concourse of my now local Jefferson Mall, or am I remembering the concourse of the Mall of Orange where I grew up? And are they even different spaces in any way that matters? In thinking about places versus non-places, Auger enlists several contrasts. For one, the realities of residence versus transit. Think about driving through the street you live on versus your local freeway. For another, the realities of crossroads where people can meet versus interchanges where people's paths do not cross. And, for that matter, the figure of the traveler strolling through a location taking part in it versus the passenger, a figure defined by their trajectory towards a destination and little else. In Dark Souls, you are constantly in motion, but through places where fallen people used to live, places where people used to gather for ceremonies, places where people immersed themselves in their own history. They are places that could only have been cursed because at one time they were loved. In contrast, I think about our expansive retail spaces. Does my local mall feel like a part of my community, or simply an air-conditioned corridor to be traversed on the increasingly rare occasion I need slacks or cologne with any immediacy? Is Walmart a place to go to meet new people, or a space in which the crowd is more an obstacle than a congregation? Am I a part of the history of my local Target? Or am I simply there to complete a consumer objective as quickly and impressionlessly as possible? Are spaces like these ever even truly destinations, or is my actual destination simply the post-transactional afterglow? Is there any space less loved than commercial real estate? That said, it's interesting how these spaces make us feel in certain conditions. It's practically impossible to talk about this subject today without touching upon the concept of liminal spaces. The word liminal comes from the Latin word for threshold, and in the context of this discussion, liminal spaces are spaces that exist between destinations, spaces of transition, literally neither here nor there. These kinds of locations have become a beloved internet trope with all the conceptual wear and tear that implies. The compelling aspect the internet has seized upon is the observation that spaces of transit or transience such as hallways, highways, hotel rooms, cubicle farms, airports, and yes, retail spaces can create a sense of deep unease when we see them denuded of human use. Empty liminal spaces trigger an uncanny valley experience in us when they feel intimately familiar, yet somehow alien when not being trod upon. Returning to the idea of liminal as threshold, perhaps these spaces become alien because we only know them as spaces meant to be exploited, meant to be conquered by foot traffic, meant optimally to feel unfelt. Professor Robert Preston White thought of liminality as a method of proceeding from the known to the unknown. He writes,
Liminal spaces are intangible, elusive, and obscure. They lie in a limbo-like space, often beyond normal social and cultural constraints. In these spaces can be found brief moments of freedom and an escape from the daily grind of social responsibilities. As a place of desire, they offer a dream time that resonates with spiritual rebirth, transformation, and recuperation. However, transitional states are also places of anxiety, replete with darker images of threat and danger. While this transition from the known to the unknown may be accompanied by unease in some cases, it may also produce a feeling of heightened sensitivity or a deeper awareness of the special qualities of a place.
Perhaps these empty liminal spaces bring us across a threshold where we're forced to confront and engage with the contours we've carved into our world. In the absence of human transaction, what are these places good for? In the case of cubicle farms, airports, and yes, retail spaces, it can feel so unreal to be there when they aren't at anyone's service, as if these places should have had the decency to stop existing if they weren't generating income. This is one of the reasons the spaces of the Dark Souls franchise are so compelling. They too are thresholds, but often ones explicitly suspended between the mundane and the divine, or demonic. They too have been cut off from the people that made them, but they still ooze with culture, craft, and history. They feel malign or melancholy, but because exploitation occurred rather than vanished. These spaces mourn the loss of community, not capital. The dominant spaces in our real world often can't make the same claim. 10 years after Auger wrote about non-places, architect Rem Koolhaas wrote a deliriously poetic diatribe in which he coined the term Junkspace. He tells us,
Junkspace is the sum total of our current achievement. We have built more than did all previous generations put together, but somehow we do not register on the same scales. We do not leave pyramids. According to a new gospel of ugliness, there is already more junk space under construction in the 21st century than has survived from the 20th. Junk space is what remains after modernization has run its course, or more precisely, what coagulates while modernization is in progress. It's fallout. Modernization had a rational program to share the blessings of science universally. Junk space is its apotheosis, or meltdown. Junk space is beyond measure, beyond code. Because it cannot be grasped, junk space cannot be remembered. It is flamboyant yet unmemorable, like a screensaver. Its refusal to freeze ensures instant amnesia. Junk space does not pretend to create perfection, only interest. Its geometries are unimaginable, only makeable. Junk space knows all your emotions. It is the interior of Big Brother's belly. It preempts people's sensations. It comes with a soundtrack, smell, captions. It blatantly proclaims how it wants to be read. Rich, stunning, cool, huge, abstract, minimal, historical. It sponsors a collective of brooding consumers in surly anticipation of their next spend, a mass of refractory periods caught in a 1,000-year reign of razzmatazz, a paroxysm of prosperity. The subject is stripped of privacy in return for access to a credit nirvana. You are complicit in the tracing of the fingerprints each of your transactions leaves. They know everything about you, except who you are.
here in the haze of painfully slow collapse that is late capitalism, I can feel myself trapped in the undertow of modern life, transitioning from places to non-places to junk spaces. This isn't some salty, curmudgeonly yearning for a fictitious golden age when men were men and buildings were rococo. This is an awareness that the seeds planted centuries ago are simply reaching full bloom today. I can't remember the last time I paid cash for something grown with love at a farmer's market. I can't remember the last time I shared laughter with a stranger on a sidewalk somewhere. Where do I spend my time that actually feels like a part of my community? Where am I taking part in rather than just passing through? I work from home, I don't have many friends, I don't go to bars, I won't go to church. I mentor with a local queer teen outreach, but even before the pandemic, that wasn't very frequent. I like to work out, but I do it for free in my basement. I like to watch movies, alone, quietly. In a given week, besides my house, the only place I really visit is the suburban sprawl of neighborhood that surrounds my house when I take my lunchtime walk. And even that's done alone with headphones on. Here in the someday grave of wilting empire, I think about the spaces that will be left behind. If cosmic travelers visit our little corner of the solar system 1,000 years from now, what will they intuit from the ruins they find? So much of our wreckage will be giant, dusty cubes with nothing in them but flecks of focused group paint jobs and the stray fibers of carpeting from a long-dead lowest bidder. I can't fathom the deepest lore they'll try to derive from a swing-line stapler buried in single-use plastic. Here in Capitalist Hospice, I see the interior of a dead mall and I can't help but think about being in 2nd grade, my grandmother taking me back to school shopping at a JCPenney's. I think about being a preteen eating chow mein with my mom and sister before looking at dogs in the pet store. I think about my dad taking me to look at computer games at Babbage's. I think about goofing off with my friends in the Spencer's Gifts and listening to pop punk at the Hot Topic. I think about being on an awkward date, gulping down a slice of Sbarro pizza, counting down the minutes. And I think about how it's been nearly 20 years since there was any consumer experience a mall could offer that I couldn't get anywhere else, cheaper, faster, and with better parking. I see a dead mall and I doubt my own history because it's painful to think a part of yourself could be supplanted by something that was merely cheaper, faster, and had better parking. Of course, a future archaeologist will glean none of this context in the ruins of the Mall of Orange, the Brea Mall, South Coast Plaza, or the Irvine Spectrum Center. Even if some American writings survive, who writes about the mall anymore? Commerce and community have moved online into the junkiest of spaces yet. Areas curated by algorithms and marketing majors into the most ephemeral, least memorable places in human history. If a feature cannot be monetized, it cannot be tolerated. Who would have thought being able to change the HTML on your MySpace page would be a curious relic of the ancient past, unimaginable to today's social media passengers? Since algorithms and venture capital don't leave fossils, what stories will be coaxed from our remains? Future archaeologists will find our skeletons entombed like Fortunato behind decaying cardboard bearing names like Stitch Fix, Blue Apron, and DoorDash. 4 cars in a driveway 15 miles from downtown, but no telling where we took those cars or who we were in solidarity with. In Dark Souls, the world is dying. Not just the current iteration of the world, but the entire cyclical universe it is built upon. In 2021, our world is dying. Not just the perennial victims of white progress in the global south, but the entire capitalist network you and I nurse ourselves on. Not so long ago, the old masters with mountains of slave-built wealth devised a scheme to stay in power, exploiting the imbalance that comes from hoarding capital, monetizing survival, and exploiting the bodies and products of the natural world in a quest for infinite growth. But the world was not meant to run like this. Infinite growth is impossible, and resources cannot be extracted eternally. The world the wealthy have crafted is polluted, leveraged, and falling apart. The sins of well-compensated colonizers now collide with the dark and dirty contradictions of capitalism as the world confronts its long-denied traumas in a mournful, primal scream. If this is it for us, if humanity cannot transcend the death drive of capital, Americans will not leave behind the towering arch trees of Lord Gwyn, the glittering shrines of Drangleic, or even the cloud-piercing turrets of Lothric. We will leave behind Junkspaces like Westfield, Eastdale, Northridge, South Point, the Galleria, the Promenade, the Grove, the Lakes, and the Summit. Oh, and the megachurches more or less indistinguishable from Westfield, Eastdale, Northridge, South Point, the Galleria, the Promenade, the Grove, the Lakes, and the Summit. My sincerest apologies to future gamers playing the version of Dark Souls that takes place in a post-apocalyptic United States. We won't have left you much to be curious or contemplative about. There will be a lot of guns to play with, though. Of course, it's not too late, you know. We can do better. Even if these are humanity's twilight years, something we still have time to influence, we can leave behind something better than Junkspaces. One of the interesting aspects of the Dark Souls series is that each game explicitly tells you there is one path to victory. Give your body to the old order. Assume the throne the old masters built for you. Throw yourself onto the fire to keep it alive just a little bit longer. But in every game, there's always another way. In every game, whether you know it or not, when all is said and done, you have the choice to walk away, to reject the old masters, to let the throne collapse, to let the age of fire burn out and make way for something new. The first time around, players often miss this choice because they're so accustomed to doing what primordial serpents tell them to. It's only after they explore the limits and contradictions of the world that they discover an agency the old masters tried to hide from them. You and I have a choice too. We can keep this age of extractive, consuming fire alive because our old masters told us it was good, or we can walk away, cross the threshold, and seek something new in the dark. Yes, the dark is scary, and yes, there's no telling what awaits us there, but wouldn't you like to build a place we can be proud of? A place worth remembering? A place unburdened by junk? Oh, and Ashen One, remember to like and subscribe, and do share this video with someone else while there's still time. Ha 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 ha.